morning. It's Wednesday, October 22nd. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 747 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. Another 2 hostages returned to Israel by Hamas yesterday. That means that the terror group still holds the bodies of 13 from those 28 hostages that they are obliged to release. Some families have been given closure while others wait in agony. My heart goes out to all of them, but I'm still concerned about the broader closure that the region needs, the closure of this war. Lots of questions still linger about where things are heading, and I fear that as the number of slain hostages dwindles, we'll find Hamas either unwilling or unable to finish the gruesome task of returning those bodies. And then what? That's the question nobody knows how to answer. Perhaps nobody wants to. Our guest this morning is Ghaith Al-Omari. Ghaith is a longtime friend of mine who participated in the Camp David talks as an advisor to Palestinian Authority President Yasser Arafat in the year 2000. Today, Ghaith is with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And I should also add, he's one of the most principled and committed advocates for coexistence in this troubled piece of real estate that we track here on this show. Ghaith is a repeat offender on the show now, and we're glad he's agreed to join us today. We'll have him on in just a few. The more I talk to folks in Israel, the more I'm concerned. Here's why. The Israelis did a masterful job in defeating the Islamic Republic of Iran and its terror proxies on 7 fronts. The Israelis then opened up an 8th front when they attacked Hamas in Qatar. That put the fear of Allah in the Qataris, who then went running to Donald Trump for protection. That's when Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu leveraged that fear into a deal that chicken-winged Qatar and its terrorist client Hamas to return the 20 live hostages and so far more than a dozen slain hostages too. But here's where it gets complicated. Somehow along the way, the Qataris and the Turks have been invited to take a role in the future of Gaza. And believe me when I tell you, those 2 countries have no interest in keeping the peace on Israel's borders. They can both create a lot of mayhem. In fact, when I look around Israel's borders, I see Turkey and Qatar with a foothold of sorts in Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and points further east. If I'm reading things right, Iran's star is fading, but it looks like the axis of the Muslim Brotherhood, namely Qatar and Turkey, are on the rise. Time is running out for Israel to challenge this arrangement. If the Israelis don't speak up now, I fear we could be witnessing the formation of a new threat matrix just as the last one unravels. Remember, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Hamas's base of operations in Turkey is reportedly growing. According to Middle East Eye, a Qatari outlet, Israel allowed 66 people to leave Gaza for Turkey, including 16 members of the late Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh's family. Apparently, this was sorted out at Turkey's behest after the Gaza ceasefire deal was signed a couple of weeks ago. Yet another sign that the United States has granted too much leverage to the Turks in this deal. It's all a bit bizarre, but if you're a regular listener on this morning program, you'll know that Turkey is a loyal patron of Hamas, and the Turks had a soft spot for Haniyeh. Back in 2020, Turkey issued passports to Haniyeh and his deputy, whose name was Saleh al-Aruri. For those keeping score at home, that's 2 members of Hamas's Politburo granted safe haven in a NATO country. Aruri went on to plan and finance the triple homicide in the West Bank that set off the war between Hamas and Israel in 2014. Israel has disrupted multiple Hamas plots hatched out of Turkey in the intervening years. As a response, Israel and the United States have, wait for it, allowed Hamas to grow its base of operations in Turkey. This is some serious bull fertilizer, folks. I don't like it one bit, and I'm not sure how we're going to derail it. Headline 2, speaking of terrible allies, Qatar's Emir gave quite the speech to his country's legislative body, as if the parliament there actually represents those 330,000 citizens, that whopping microstate. Yesterday, Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al-Thani slammed Israel for committing genocide and violating the ceasefire in Gaza. Did he mention Hamas's October 7th massacre? No. Did he mention that Hamas provoked Israel over the weekend by ambushing and killing multiple soldiers? Also no. Did he mention the summary execution of Gazans on the streets? Also no. This is what we call textbook incitement, folks, and selective criticism. It's typical stuff from the regime that harbored and financed Hamas. And yes, let me hammer home once again that this slime bag regime is now officially tapped to take part in post-war Gaza. What I'm worried about right now is that Qatar will help Hamas rebrand, just as it is done with other terror proxies. Remember the Nusra Front in Syria? Yeah, the Al-Qaeda group that partnered with ISIS. Well, Qatar swooped in and helped the group rebrand as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. And guess what? HTS is now the official government in Syria, and its leader just spoke in front of the UN. Coming soon to a Gaza Strip near you, and I'm nauseous. Headline 3, speaking of Syria, the new regime seized a massive haul of captagon pills. We're talking about 12 million tablets. In case you're not up on your recreational drugs in the Middle East, captagon is a party drug used by young folks in the Persian Gulf region. It's also used by jihadis like Hamas and other groups in Syria. It's big money profits from the captagon trade that bankrolled Syria's former Assad regime. It generated more revenue for Assad and his cronies than all of Syria's legal exports combined. When Syria's new rulers ousted Assad in December, they pledged to crack down on the narco trade, but they haven't been wholly successful, particularly in areas of weak central authority, particularly in the south. Still, the new regime, imperfect as it may be, continues to track down Assad-era captagon factories, kingpins, and drug hauls, and that's heartening to see. This latest bust was one of the largest since Syria's new rulers came to power 10 months ago. And bonus headline 4, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hosted Egyptian intelligence chief Hassan Rashad yesterday. This meeting was long overdue. Ties between these two countries are downright frigid at the moment. Egypt is not happy with Israel for fighting back against Hamas, as if it had a choice. But right now, the Israelis are eyeing a military buildup in the Sinai that has folks in the IDF more nervous than I have seen in quite a while. Stay tuned for more whenever we get additional information on that front. And now it's time for that discussion with Ghaith Al-Omari of the Washington Institute. Let's welcome him onto the show. Welcome back to the program, Ghaith Al-Omari.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Good to have you. Good to see you. All right, let's talk about the political affairs in Gaza. Is it realistic to expect Hamas to disarm voluntarily? That seems kind of insane to me, but that's what we're asking of them. And I think the other question that I have for you is, what about these battles between the clans and Hamas? Are we seeing an insurrection of sorts? Does this thing have legs? How to understand where things are heading politically in the Gaza Strip?
Actually, John, before I answer, if I may kind of act to a couple of things you said earlier. One, I remember you were the first person to draw my attention to Saleh Haruri many years ago. And, I continue to see you as one of the people who follow these things in the deep weeds that many of us don't. And you talked about the Qatari Emir talking to his parliament. Worth noting that last year, I think in November, they canceled any election for this parliament. So it's an elected parliament. And what's amazing is Al Jazeera, human rights organization, not a peep about this. So just to put this out there. Now, in terms of Hamas, I think look, disarming any insurgency, any terror group is a very heavy lift. And I think everyone understands this. So what we see right now is two tracks happening. On the one hand, a track of pressure coming from the Israelis, coming from the Americans, but we're also seeing the Egyptians trying to basically engage in a political process with Hamas to disarm. I think the example they bring is how the IRA in Ireland disarmed. I am very worried. I'm very worried because if you strike a deal with Hamas that talks about partial disarmament, and that's what we're really hearing coming from the region, that gives a degree of legitimacy to their weapons. That is a dangerous precedent. And of course, this kind of lays the ground for conflict in the future. Now, when it comes to the fights in Gaza with the clans, I mean, this is not an insurgency. This is something we've seen over and over again. Hamas, after every war and after even every ceasefire in this war, will go after anyone who is potentially a threat. They don't want to see any of those become a threat. However, what we do see is a large expression of Palestinians in Gaza just fed up with Hamas. I mean, there's a bad narrative out there that these clans are, gangs, etc., collaborators. Some of them maybe. Most of them were basically clans that were unhappy with the war and wanted to create their own safe space. And unless the world intervenes strongly, I expect to see more and more of this. And one last point here is what Hamas is doing is not only trying to assert control on the ground. Hamas is trying to create a reality that will make it much harder in the future to replace it as a government or to get into the disarmament thing. So if this is not stopped now, we might be facing this, might be harder to stop it in the future.
Yeah, I do think we need to start to handle this immediately. And I don't know how that happens as long as Hamas is brandishing arms in the Gaza Strip. Nobody's going to want to come in. And that's the paradox of where we are at this moment. But speaking of paradoxes, let's talk about the role of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. We know they want a role. We know the Israelis don't want that, or at least the Netanyahu government doesn't want it. We know that some of the Arab states are still angling for it. What do you expect to come out of this conversation right now?
Actually, I mean, for the time being, the administration, and here I have to give a lot of credit to the Trump administration. They managed to find the kind of point of balance that everyone can live with, a conceptual future role for the Palestinian Authority, but understanding reality, there is no role now. Now, this is true not only because Israel doesn't want it. At the end of the day, I mean, Israel is going to have to accept things that might not want. That's the nature of any deal. But the Palestinian Authority today lacks the capability and the credibility to do this. The capability, they're too weak. The credibility, they're too corrupt. Not only vis-a-vis their own people, but also vis-a-vis the donor community. And unless we see a serious reform effort happening in the Palestinian Authority, it's very hard to see how it can ever play a role. But for now, even a symbolic role is needed by the Arab countries because it will give them some top cover to come in and say our intervention in Gaza is not in support of the Israeli action, but a step to bring back the legitimate Palestinian government into Gaza. This is nice fiction, but unless there is a reform, it will remain a fiction.
You know, it would help if Abu Mazen were not in power, right? I mean, this guy's been around now for 2 decades, has not held an election. Nobody has any confidence in this guy. So you think about what they're trying to install, and it's this Al-Thani who's got zero power, falling asleep at meetings, corrupt as hell. Nobody wants him. I don't even think the Arab states want him. And that's, I think, what the challenge is, isn't it?
John, I mean, when I say reform, I'm not talking only about technical reform, which is needed. I am talking primarily about political reform. A political reform starts with removing the current leadership. Abbas, he's a 90-some-year-old man whose whole brand is failure. You just cannot politically rehabilitate someone at that point. No Arab leader that I've spoken to has any trust, whether in his intentions, his capabilities, or the fact that he's not going to pocket any money and run with it. So when you talk about reform, you need to change the current leadership. Not necessarily through elections, etc., that may be asking for too much, but you need to bring a leadership that is more accepted among the region, but sends a message to the Palestinians that there is change, there is rejuvenation. Short of that, you can do whatever technical reform you do, it will remain lacking in credibility because the top guy lacks credibility.
Yeah, and really, I think that's an understatement. All right, Jordan is a country well known to you. What are you watching out of Amman right now? I mean, I know things are not great with Israel. I know the war has been really rough on this country, and things are not great internally. So what would your analysis be right now, sort of shorthand, about what's going on in probably one of the most important countries in the region for Israel as they think about stability after the war?
I mean, first of all, I want to point out that, yes, the relation between the two political leaderships, Jordan and Israel, is really, really, really bad on both sides. There's zero trust. But the relation between the militaries and the intelligence services is top-notch, continues to be top-notch. And I think this is the bedrock of this relationship. Always tensions, always points of kind of friction, but that's to be expected in any relationship. As I look at Jordan today, I'm actually not that worried. Domestically, they seem to have things under control. One thing that I think is worth noting that they're really cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood, and this time it's for real. And the noose is tightening. I mean, they've banned the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization. Now they're tightening the noose around the Muslim Brotherhood's political party. So to my mind, this is key. And this is, I think, one of the lessons that they learned from the last 2 years. The Muslim Brotherhood is a force of instability in Jordan and, frankly, have organic relations with Hamas against the interests of the country. But as I look at Jordan's foreign policy, I think their first priority right now is to avoid at any cost getting entangled in Gaza. They don't want to send troops to Gaza. They don't want to get involved in Gaza. This is an Egyptian problem, an Israeli problem. They don't want to own it. Their main concern at the moment is the West Bank, and there is fear. Frankly, the idea of annexation keeps popping up. Today in the Knesset, they, I think, passed the first reading of a law. So they're worried about that. And they're worried about that because they feel that if things go really south in the West Bank, it becomes, A, domestically destabilizing, but B, becomes very hard to maintain the intelligence and military relations with Israel, and these will come under strain. But by and large, this is a country that knows how to survive, and I'm not particularly worried.
Right. Well, it's interesting that crackdown on the Brotherhood that you mentioned, that's coming amidst some really interesting things coming out of Washington right now. We're hearing at least some reports of a Trump administration action of sorts against the Brotherhood that would potentially buttress the regime's ability to crack down further on the Brotherhood and maybe even see that spread to other countries around the region. That seems like a good thing to me, and I guess we'll keep on watching that. And speaking of Brotherhood, I mean, I mentioned Egypt earlier. That's the that's sort of the mothership of the Brotherhood, if you will. It's where it was founded. Are you worried right now about the Sisi regime and its ties to the United States, its peace with Israel, its stability? I mean, I got to say, I'm nervous. When I look at what's happening in the Sinai, when I see the sorts of things that are talked about by the Sisi regime, things don't look right. I'm not saying that they ever look great, but they really don't look good right now. What's going on from your perspective?
Actually, again, I'm less worried about Egypt-Israel relations, Egypt-US relations. I think both of these, certainly Egypt-US, I think, the fact that President Trump went to Sharm el-Sheikh, and it's a nod to Egypt. So I think I'm less worried about this. And with Israel, it's worth remembering that the buildup in the Sinai actually came with Israeli blessing initially, at least. Yes, there are tensions, yet the peace treaty with with Israel is a bedrock for that regime. Where I'm more worried is domestically. The economy is in really bad shape, and it continues getting worse, partly because of the war, but partly because of domestic mismanagement. And I think the leadership in Egypt believes that they are too big to fail, and this has proven right until it stops proving right. So I'm worried about this. But also I'm worried about the young generation. I mean, if you were to talk 2-3 years ago, I would say, I'm not worried because the Egyptians are tired of instability after the Arab Spring. Now you have a generation that has not lived the Arab Spring. And they're angry. We're seeing protests in Morocco. We're seeing protests all over the world. And I see a lot on kind of, Egyptian social media space, people saying, if they're doing it in Morocco, why don't we do it here? Remember, the Arab Spring started with a guy in Tunisia burning himself. And so I worry about this. I worry about the generation that is tired, that is lacking hope, and that sees other young people, whether it's in Morocco, whether it's in Iran, whether it's even in Nepal, moving, and this might become infectious. So that's where I would actually focus, and of course on the question of the economy.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing those Gen Z, Gen Alpha protests in Morocco, and I think exactly to your point, I started thinking the other day as I was learning about those that, it does remind me a bit about what happened in Tunisia at the beginning of the Arab Spring. Look, I certainly welcome the idea of youth in the Arab world reclaiming a sense of political belonging. But I think at the expense of stability across the region, that's where I begin to get a little bit more.
Actually, John, here, this is, I think, this is a warning sign. And unless you give the youth in the region an outlet, they will explode. And here, honestly, I mean, I look at what the Gulf is doing in terms of creating opportunities for their young people. And I think that's the model to follow. So it's going to be interesting to see how much those countries will create outlets. But in Egypt in particular, I just don't see even signs of willing to go there.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Well, you mentioned the Gulf. Briefly, I mean, I get the sense they're not exactly thrilled about everything that's going on. I think they're happy that the war in Gaza is on pause and maybe even be heading to a more permanent pause. But the few conversations that I've had recently with folks from the Gulf is that they're on the outside looking in. And they see that Qatar and Turkey have been rewarded with bad behavior. and they're reaping the rewards of having engaged in that bad behavior, while these stalwart allies of the United States and I mean, with the UAE, they stuck by the Israelis the entire time. Right now, they seem like bit players in all of this. Am I wrong here?
You're absolutely right on all counts. I think when I talk to friends in the Gulf, that's exactly what I'm hearing. Why are you rewarding the bad guys? Now, it was understandable that you bring Turkey and Qatar to do the ceasefire. They have leverage on Hamas, etc. But looking forward, as they see, President Erdogan sitting at the head of the table in New York next to President Trump, if they see what's happened in Sharm el-Sheikh, etc., they are worried because, yes, they look at Qatar as part of the GCC and whatever, but is the black sheep of the family. Now, where I am actually critical of countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia is basically stop complaining and come and be proactive. We've seen this in the past. Sitting back and complaining and criticizing basically creates the space for the bad actors to come in and shape the game. I am hopeful, the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, is going to be here in Washington, I think on the 18th of November. I hope they use this opportunity to not only criticize, but to proactively come and say we're willing to play a role. The Emiratis have a lot of capabilities and they've done a lot of actually planning on this and discussion with the Israelis and the Americans, but they need to come in and say, we are also willing to lead. Other than that, by default, it's going to be Qatar and Turkey.
I'm kind of chuckling here. The idea of Gulf and proactive, those are two words I don't often say kind of in the same sentence. That's not sort of, I mean, we're not looking at the, let's just say the most bold although I will say the Saudis have their own bold plan for the future and the same thing for the Emiratis. But in terms of politics and engaging with conflict, they're usually pretty skittish. But I want to let you go. You've been very generous with your time. I want to ask for a prediction here. What happens next? Do we get all the hostages back? Does calm prevail? Will Gaza get split in two? What should we watch for from your perspective in the days and maybe weeks to come?
Look, I don't know about the hostages. I am hopeful that the vast majority of the deceased will return. But if I were to guess, I would guess there would be one or two who will not be returned in the short term. Look, as I look at the short term, I'm actually optimistic. This is the Middle East, so optimism is very low bar, but I'm optimistic in the sense that I just don't see a return to the full-out war. Both societies are tired, the region is tired, and most importantly, I think the momentum we're seeing coming from Washington is such that I just don't see anyone breaking the ceasefire. I am less optimistic when it comes to, phase 2 and phase 3 and the rest of the kind of 20 peace plan. Talks about an international force at a very embryonic stage, talk about an international board and, non-political Palestinian government, very embryonic stage. And as time passes, Hamas becomes more entrenched. And I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong. But what I see coming in the future is something similar to what we see today in Lebanon, where Hamas continues, frankly, to be the real power there. And Israel will occasionally, every 2 or 3 days, whack someone. It is not a stable situation, but certainly better than a full-out war. I hope I'm wrong, and frankly, I've learned over the last weeks to basically give enough credit to this administration to maybe think they will come up with something, but by and large, a long road ahead.
Yeah, I think incremental progress seems to be the rule here, and we're seeing that, and maybe we can celebrate that at least for now. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Ghaith Al-Omari, for joining us this morning on the FDD Morning.
Always a pleasure, John.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Mark Montgomery has a new insight on FDD's website outlining 5 key ways the U.S. and Europe can and should support Ukraine, from delivering weapon systems to preparing Kyiv for eventual Euro-Atlantic military integration. Good stuff over there from Monty. Meanwhile, FDD's Mariam Wahba has a sharp piece in the Free Press on the Trump administration's proposed designation of several Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated groups as foreign terrorist organizations. There's just one issue. The administration is overlooking a major driver of Brotherhood ideology: their media outlets, which spread disinformation as freely as Qatar and Turkey bankroll Hamas. You can dismantle terror groups, but you can't kill an idea. That's their strategy, How are we going to counter it? And if you haven't heard enough from me yet, I've got a new piece in commentary arguing that now is no time for Israel to take a breather. With all remaining living hostages released, the country must now confront a bunch of other challenges, like judicial reform, ultra-Orthodox military service, a banged-up economy, a damaged international standing. The list goes on. Chapter 1 of the October 7th war is over. Chapter 2 is about to begin. All right, time to call it quits for today. If you need more think tankery, you want to get smart, check out the expert analysis on our website, FDD.org, and across all of our socials, of course. And yes, folks, you still can make a generous tax-deductible donation at FDD.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another riveting, can't-miss episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, as always, signing off for FDD.